snow and exploding and burning, and I went down on one, and I was shooting at him, and he crashed in the snow, and we're climbing back up, and with my element leader, and we were about 15,000 feet, and I saw an airplane out of my left side vision flying across in front of me, and we were climbing at a sharp angle, and this airplane flew right across in front of me, and when just before he got to me, he turned upside down, and the pilot.
Okay, we were at the dogfight, and the one plane's coming across.
Well, this ME-109 flew from left to right across above me and in front of me, and turned upside down, and the pilot dropped out. And of course,
out of the plane?
Yeah, he bailed out. And he opened the canopy and just dropped out. And as soon as he cleared the airplane, he opened his chute. And I thought, I'm gonna run into him. He's right in front of me and above me, and I was going right at him. So I had to skid to one side. I jammed the rudder in to the right and put the stick over to the right and just skidded over to the side to miss him, because I didn't want to tangle him up. I didn't want to run into him, tangle him up in my prop. And he saw that he evidently was involved or saw that dogfight, and everybody he was with got shot down, and he wasn't going to hang around for somebody to shoot him down.
Huh.
And he opened his chute, and I skidded to one side, and I got far enough to the right for him to pass off my left wing. Well, he didn't pass any further than the length of maybe 30 or 40 feet off of the end of my left wing, and I could see him real plain. And he was holding. He had on gloves and a black jacket and black helmet, and he was holding his hands up over his eyes like that, because he thought I was shooting at him, because he saw smoke coming back off my guns from previous firing, and I wasn't shooting at him. We didn't shoot them in the chutes. They would shoot us in the chutes, but we didn't shoot them in the chutes.
Oh.
And when I went by him, the prop wash collapsed half of his chute, and I thought, uh-oh. But I kept on climbing. I couldn't do anything about that. But this airplane had a rear view mirror up over the canopy, and it's a round mirror, and I could look in that and see him. And I looked at him, and his chute filled up again, and he floated on down. And we climbing on up, and as we climbed on up, why my element leader, he caught up to me then. He was flying off to my right, and he said, look to your left about 3,000 or 4,000 feet below us. And there's an ME-262. And I looked over there, and I said, yeah. And he said, well, we're going to get him. Follow me. And so he turned across me and went diving down toward this ME-262. And that was one of Germany's twin jet fighters. They're new jets. And this guy was in a left turn, and not a real steep turn, but in a left turn, and he evidently never saw us. Of course, they were just checking out in those airplanes. It was new to them, and they were trying to find out how to fly it and how to operate it. And I don't believe he ever saw us. I was following the flight leader and right behind him, and this plane was just turning like that, and we were coming from up here, and he just slid down in behind him and right underneath him. And when he got in range, he started firing, and he was so close to him, when he started firing, he had to break off. But his 50 calibers were hitting the airplane, because we shot armor-piercing incendiaries, and when they struck anything, why, they sparkle. Looked like a Christmas sparkler. Sparkle, sparkle, sparkle all over. And he broke away, and I was just pulling down on the trigger when that plane was still in a bank, and the firing was from the bottom up, and out of the top side of the cockpit floated about 4 or 5, I guess it was bubbles, about as big as a basketball, but they were on fire, and it must have been oxygen bubbles that the armor-piercing incendiaries had set on fire. And before I could pull the trigger, the German jet just flipped over and went straight down, and crashed in the snow. I followed him all the way down, and he didn't get out. When it flipped over, he was dead, because he was dead before I started shooting at him, because of being in the position that we're in. It went right up through the cockpit, right through, and he didn't have a chance. But I don't think he ever saw us. If he did, he didn't act like it, because found out later that if he'd have seen us, all he'd had to do was to turn that sucker upside down and open the throttle, and he pulled away from us like we tied to a tree. Yeah. That we had an anchor out. And anyway, I pulled up off of that, and I knew we were heading back for England, because after we'd been in a dogfight so that long, why our fuel was running too low to complete the mission, and we would go back to England, and the other half of our group would escort the bombers. And so I didn't know where my flight leader was, and I couldn't see him anywhere. And above me, side, below me, anywhere. And so I just took up a heading for England and started climbing out. And I got back up to about 12,000 feet, and on the radio, he come on the radio and on the fighter channel and says, "Look at 2 o'clock high." And I looked up to my right, and there he was. And I joined up on him, and we flew back to England and landed, and that was the end of that mission. That was my first mission.
Huh. You saw a jet on your first mission.
And later on, while we were involved a couple of other different times with those same jets, but usually they could, if they turned, if they got in a dogfight with you and turned, a P-51 could turn inside of them and cut them off and get them. But they learned not to turn. They just straighten out and really advance the throttle, or they dive and advance the throttle, and they didn't have any problem. One time over Holland and North Germany, we got involved with a couple of them, but we didn't get them, and because they knew what to do. Another time, we were escorting bombers to Berlin, and we were the low cover, and we were also supposed to really fly a lot lower than we would with the bombers. We were ahead of the bombers, and we were looking for German airfields for German fighters to be taken off from, to get them out of the way before the bombers got there. And we were at about 10,000 feet, and all of a sudden we come into an area where there was cloud cover just above us, a couple of thousand feet above us. And of course we flew in a line abreast formation, and they were strung out line abreast, but there was a couple of, well, we called them spares. They were extra airplanes that weren't in the flight, flying back of us, purple flight, and if someone had a problem and had to return to base, well, they'd come in and fill his spot. Well, we were flying along there, and one of those guys in purple flight was a guy in my outfit that when he talked on the radio, he would sound like he was in a panic, and he pressed his mic button and said, of course we wore throat mics then, and he pressed his mic button on the throttle and said, "Bogies in 6 o'clock high," And about that time, he said, they're firing on me, and boy, they started firing on him, and he turned, and they just made a diving pass, and they didn't hit him, they fired at him. And it was 2 German ME-262s, and when he turned, he pulled the trigger on his machine guns, and he still had the mic down, and with those 650 calibers firing over that radio, it sounded like it was right in the cockpit with me, and I almost twisted my head around 306 degrees looking for the guy shooting at me. I didn't realize that quickly that I couldn't hear him shooting anyway. If another airplane is shooting at you, you couldn't hear him shooting. and we, of course, we dove down on those guys, but we didn't even have them in sight, but just a little ways, and it was hazy down on the deck. They just dove down the deck, took off, and it was like we had an anchor out. We no way that we could do them. Another mission to Berlin, just before we got to Berlin, a few miles outside of Berlin, we were flying high cover for the bombers and low cover, and one of the guys, I was in low cover, and one of the guys in high cover was hit by 105 millimeter German anti-aircraft fire, and he bailed out, and his airplane, and he floated down in his chute, and his airplane went on down into another one of those stubble fields with about 6-inch high stubble, and crashed and burned, and he landed right near the airplane. And by the time he landed, there was about 3 circles at different altitudes, one right down on the deck, and one at about 300 or 400 feet, and one at a couple of 100 feet above those, circling him. And when we were circling him, the ones that I wasn't in low cover, I was in the top cover, and I was watching those in low cover circling around, and could see a car or some kind of vehicle come up on this field. It was in the country. Come up on this field on a little road and stop. But they stopped, and it must have been almost a mile from where the airplane was burning. But they could see the airplane burning, and they were 2 soldiers, and they come running across the fields to go over there and capture this pilot that had just landed in his parachute. And needless to say, they also had a German shepherd with them, one of their army dogs with them. They had a lot of those German shepherds they used, trained for guard dogs and so forth in the army. And needless to say, they didn't make it just about halfway to that pilot because there was too many P-51s circling around to let those guys go in there and capture that pilot. And the dog and both of them just there. And then the next thing I know, one of the P-51s had his gear down and making an approach to that field to land. And we'd been told not to land and pick up shot down pilots in the 51s because they'd done that a couple of times in France and got stuck in the mud. And they lost another pilot, another airplane. Yep. And this was a no-no. Well, this pilot, he come in and landed, and when his wheels touched down, I thought he's going to make it because dust flew up from the wheels, and the ground was hard, and he went to the edge of the trees and got stopped and turned around and taxied back up to where this guy was getting out of his parachute harness, and stopped, and he left the engine running and jumped out on the wing of his 51 and took his parachute off and threw it on the field, on the ground, and the other guy jumped up on the wing by then, and the guy that got shot down, he sat down in the seat first, and the pilot sat on his lap. And they turned that thing around into the wind and took off, and we escorted them back to England.
Holy cow. Wow.
We heard about that years later.
And of course, the pilot that landed and picked him up, they had to reprimand him, but hey, they didn't do anything. he really, I think he finally got a medal for it or something, a DFC or something for it. But they were really happy. And the guy that got shot down was one of the squadron leaders. He was a leader of 335, I think. He was a major, and this Lieutenant Green was in his squadron, and he wasn't going to leave him there. He's going to land that airplane. Of course, there wasn't any of us that wouldn't do it. You know, as far as that goes, we didn't believe that there wasn't anything we couldn't do, because if you thought that you couldn't fly that 51 better than any German could fly a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt or a jet fighter, hey, you wouldn't be around very long, because you wouldn't be thinking about anything but that. And the next thing you know, they'd be sending you home to straitjacket. Yeah. It happened to some guys. Yeah. We went on another mission, and one time, and of course we went on many bomber. Our was bomber escort, but part of the half of the squadron, after we escorted them into the target and they headed back home, while half of the squadron would go down on the deck and take the A train home. And what that meant was that half of the squadron was looking for transportation, locomotives, German locomotives, to blow them up. And I was on the A train part of the group, and we come up on a German steam engine, and of course that German steam engine didn't go much further, because the boiler was blown up and everything else, and nothing but steam and everything out of it. Another mission, why we had the low altitude take the A train home, and I looked down below, and there was this big area of barracks and all down there, you know. And I thought, well, that must be a German army camp, what it looked like. But we were, you know, 10 or 12,000 feet, and we didn't make any pass at it. And of course, on our maps, why, it wasn't any mark where German army camps were or anything. And we didn't have that kind of intelligence then. We went on home, and then on about a second or third mission after that, why, our whole group was assigned to destroy the airplanes on the airfield, German airfield at Prague, Czechoslovakia. And this was later in the war, of course, and Patton was, of course, into Germany by now, and they'd kept pulling the airplanes back and pulling the airplanes back, and they had pictures and information that there was a lot of airplanes on this airfield. Well, we went on that airfield, and it was early in the morning, but the sun was up, and first pass over the field, why, there was a ME-262, not 262, 110 German fighter, twin-engine German fighter, out on the field with the engines turning over. And evidently the crew chief had just gotten in there and did the morning pre-flight and started the engines, make sure they run all right and everything. And I saw it as I went across the field, and I fired on that. But then, as I went across the field on my left, in a V in the trees, I saw airplanes lined up on the far side of the V, wingtip to wingtip. German fighters and all kind of airplanes lined up there. And the procedure was to, when you went across the field strafing, you made a right turn, and everybody was in the same pattern, going in the same direction. Well, being independent like everybody else, I didn't want to make no right turn because I knew I could make a left turn and get back to those airplanes real quick, and I'd pick that row of them out for my own. Well, I made a left turn and went right down on top of the buildings and along the edge of town, and made another left turn and come back in across the little fields and all. And when I approached that V in the trees, why, I was so low until I had to pull up to go over the trees. When I pulled up and put the nose down again, as soon as I was up above the trees, I just dumped the nose again, and I was right in line with the first airplane, but the V was like this, and I was coming like this, and I couldn't shoot the lengthwise of them, I was shooting crosswise of them. And besides that, I didn't want to make a long run on those airplanes because they had anti-aircraft guns on that field. And as I dumped the nose down, I was just at the right range where those 650 calibers crossed like that, and it just took a short burst, and it sparkled, and boom, it blew up like you'd set off dynamite or TNT or something in them. Evidently, those airplanes had just enough fuel in them and fumes to blow up whenever the armor-piercing incendiaries struck. Well, I could only get one, so I just went down on top of the buildings and flew around again, and it was flat-top buildings and all, but shucks, I was right on the trees and on top of the buildings, and flew around and made another pass. And after when I blew up the fifth one, I didn't pull up soon enough. And it was, incidentally, about the fourth one or fifth one, one or the other, I forget which, I guess about the fourth one, maybe it's the fifth one, was a Army Air Corps B-24 bomber. But they used our bombers when they captured one that was flyable to go up and join our formations and then call back on German radio and tell their anti-aircraft gunners what the speed was, the direction, the altitude, and everything, so they could fire at that altitude and explode shells at that altitude. And so they used our airplanes, but they wouldn't use that one anymore. But when I didn't pull up soon enough, I flew through the explosion, and pieces of the airplane that blew up pierced the fuselage in back of me, and I didn't really know it, but of course I flew through that stuff and right down on the deck again. As I started around, while something was spraying on my face, and I wiped my face and looked at it, and it wasn't even blood. I thought maybe I was bleeding. I could feel it running down my face. It wasn't even blood. And I looked back, and one of those pieces of that airplane had cut a hole in the line, the coolant line. It was glycol, coolant, and it was spraying out on me. And it was a liquid-cooled engine. And I thought, well, I was almost halfway around by then. And I thought, I'll make one more pass and I'll leave, because lose all the coolant, and that thing was really pouring the coolant out, this engine's going to stop. And that'll be it. I better have some place to set her down. I made one more pass, blew up one more airplane, and then's when I made my mistake. I pulled up to about 300 feet, and they were waiting for me. They had 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, German anti-aircraft guns, on top of those flat-top buildings, and I realized my mistake, and I looked to the left, and because out of the corner of my eye I could see something over there, and what I was seeing was the flashes of the anti-aircraft explosions right at my altitude, and also you could see red in them, and when you could see red in them in daylight, they were close. It was just reaction. I just jammed the stick into, I twisted my head around, looked to the rear, and jammed the stick in the firewall at the same time, and they were following me right in back of me. And as I jammed the stick in the firewall, it didn't even change attitudes. Right in front of me, 1, 2, 3, and the third one right in the engine. Now the nose, of that airplane, well, how far it is from the nose to the cockpit, Well, of course, it right in the middle of the engine, sounded like it was in the cockpit when it exploded. Smoke, and of course the engine immediately was killed, and oil sprayed back on the windshield, and white smoke of the coolant, burned coolant, was spewing out the stacks, and I was over the edge of town, so I knew I had to make a slight left turn and line up with those little fields I was coming across on the approach to shoot those airplanes. And there was two big power lines. I went over one and under the other one. The engine's dead now, no power. And then I turned slightly to line up with one of these little fields, and I went across a little creek or canal or something, and up the other side, and then there was more level fields, but I could see I was getting too close to the road out from town, where houses all along the road, and I wouldn't be able to land before I got to that. But all along the back of those houses, there was people, thousands of them, standing out along the back of the houses and in the edge of this field, just looking like it was a circus or something, like an air show. And as I was coming toward them, I thought, you people got to be crazy. You could get killed out here. I really didn't realize what they were looking at, because I hadn't seen in back of me. I was just working my little corner of the field, and I didn't see what was happening on the rest of the field, besides what I was doing, fires I was lighting up. Anyway, I was going right toward them, and then I made a 90-degree turn, and still descending. Of course, naturally, I'm watching the airspeed very close, and knew that he had to leave the gear up. There wasn't any chance to land it. This field had little furrows in it that stuff was planted on. It wasn't very deep, furrows, but it had little furrows in it. And I just kept on the landing approach and parallel to those people, and about, maybe 50 yards or so from them, and parallel to them, and the tail touched, and then it slowly settled down, and I was so busy doing everything, I didn't even think about the canopy. You could blow the canopy and get rid of it, or roll it back. But I thought about it, but then I thought about it, and I thought, I can't do it anyway, because if I blow the canopy or roll it back, all that smoke from the engine and all was going to come right in the cockpit. And it would, it'd suck it right in the cockpit. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't see anything then. And when that thing was landing, while the prop was turning over real slow, and that big full-bladed prop turned over. Huh?
Go ahead and grab your plane.
This?
Yeah.
This big prop turned over real slow, and it wasn't turning over slow. I know it was turning over fast, but it looked slow to me. Yeah. I could actually count the blades as they hit the ground, and when they hit the ground, the tips of the blades turned outward, and I thought they'd turn in, because you were going like that, but they turned out. Huh. And one, two, the third one, when the fourth one hit, the plane just says crump, and it kind of tilted up on its nose a little bit, not all the way up, not up, but just tilted on its nose, and boy, it really stopped suddenly and then settled back down. But it stopped so suddenly, and I'd forgotten to lock my shoulder harness. On the side of the seat was a half moon-shaped control with a little latch on it that you push down, and you push it forward to lock it, and you pull it back to unlock it. Well, when you're in a dogfight or strafing, you left the shoulder harnesses unlocked so you could reach everything. That shoulder harness was unlocked, and that airplane had the latest thing in gun sights in it. It had a K-14 gyro computing gun sight, and it sat right in front of your face, right on the top of the instrument panel, right in front of you. And mine was an early model. It didn't have a rubber crash pads and all on it that the later models had. It just had dials and pointers that you had to set on there to make the gun sight work right. And the gun sight worked as a reflection of light on the windshield. And it was actually little diamond-shaped reflections with the point of the diamonds pointing in around in a circle, and then there was a dot in the center, and it was just a reflection. And by twisting the throttle, you could open up the diamonds or close them. And what that was if you were shooting at an airplane from the side,